Jonathan is a retired professor of biology who specialized in plant communities and succession. He and his wife Priscilla participate in the Silver City Flora group and rare plant surveys for the state of New Mexico and spend a lot of time out in the Gila looking at flora and exploring all the great plants we have here. We're really fortunate to have them here in Silver City. So please welcome John Titus.
Hello, thank you for coming, and thank you, Donna. Thank you, Kara. And so, guess we'll go ahead and start. In an hour and a half, we'll have a pee break. So, hopefully, you can hold it for that long. So, today we're going to talk about mycorrhizae, and if you've been out and about, you've seen that this spring has been absolutely beautiful. Just these vast expanses of flowers and whatnot. And you look at this, and there's a lot going on above ground. But what people don't think about as much is that there is a lot, if not more, going on below ground that is out of sight. So that's why mycorrhizae is important, because it's a big part of what is going on below ground. And mycorrhizae means very cool in Greek. So let's see if I can forward.
Maybe the arrow, John.
With the mouse, because I was pressing the little thing. But there we go. So mycorrhizae is a mutualism. That's a type of symbiosis. And if you've forgotten, a symbiosis is a long-term close interaction. So a mutualism is interaction. It's beneficial to both participants. And you are all mutualists, because of course in your gut is billions of bacteria that are really vital to your health. And you all know about pollination and clownfish and anemone, corals, where there's a mutualist that does the photosynthesis, ants and aphids, lichen, a really tight mutualistic relationship. And this is one of my favorites, the woolly bat and the pitcher plant. And the pitcher plant has special acoustic reflectors on the plant that then attract the bats, and the bats roost in the pitcher and poop. And that's how the pitcher plant gets at least a third of its nitrogen. So one thing about these kind of mutualisms is this is the norm. This is how nature works. This is where evolution goes, towards more and more complex mutualistic relationships. And mycorrhizae is big. The mycorrhizal fungi transfers 13 gigatons of sugar from plants to the soil every year. This is 10% of total global photosynthesis. So it's a lot. 60% of soil carbon is due to mycorrhizal fungi. So it's a major global force. There we go, I did it. So mycorrhizae has entered popular culture. And two of the major ways it's done that, of course, in Avatar, if you remember when Sigourney Weaver joined the mycorrhizal mother tree, became part of it. And who remembers? Who's seen that? Okay, yeah, like everybody. Okay. And then another one is the Star Trek Discovery, where the spaceship travels around on a mycelial network. And that is a subspace dimension of fungal spores. And I love this sentence because it's based on real world mycorrhizae. This network acts as a cosmic, interconnected, conscious system spanning the multiverse. That's a mouthful. And so definitely spaceships can travel around that way. So I'll start now introducing the mycorrhizae, and the singular is Mycorrhiza. And mycorrhizae is the name of the relationship. So you have the mycorrhizal plant and the mycorrhizal fungi. And when they're together, they do the mycorrhizae. So this is a mutually beneficial, of course, like any mutualism, not always beneficial, but the vast majority of the time, between fungi and plant roots in almost every plant species, more than 85%. the fungi colonize roots and they build this vast hyphal network that spreads throughout the soil, dramatically increasing the amount of soil explored. So you can see that in this picture here. This is what the roots could do. And the fungi can really spread out and explore more soil. Also, fungi are much better at extracting nutrients from soil. A lot of these nutrients, especially phosphorus, plants can't get, but the fungus can. And then these nutrients are transported to the plant root, to the plant. So in exchange for these nutrients, the fungus gets anywhere from 1% to 60%. Usually it's not at quite either extreme, but often it's a third, or it is often half of the sugar that is produced in photosynthesis goes to the fungus. And that shows how important this relationship is to the plant, because it's giving a lot of what it produces in photosynthesis. The nutrients that the fungus picks up and sends to the plant include phosphorus, the most important, but also nitrogen, zinc, copper, and phosphorus especially, very difficult to extract from the soil for plants. And plants also get increased resistance to disease, drought, salinity, and also heavy metals will stick to the hyphae in the fungus and not go to the plant. So it also protects against heavy metals. Just in case you were mixed up about that a little bit, remember that hyphae is the microscopic thread. That is the body of a fungus. A fungus is microscopic threads that grow and branch and spread out. And mycelium, like when you see a mushroom, that is a whole bunch of hyphae glommed together. Okay. So there's a lot in this slide. We're not going to talk about it all. It's just sort of an example. But this underground network has been critical to plant evolution, soil ecosystems, soil organic matter, stabilizing it, and the global carbon balance. So, of course, this is a relationship as complex as always in flux. So this is all the stuff that's going on in the soil. We're not going to have time to talk about too much of what's going on in the soil. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. There's all kinds of categories, a lot going on, from soil health and fertility to water holding to all kinds of proteins that are gluing the soil together, interesting chemicals and compounds. One of the most important is this glomalin-related soil protein, which is a really sticky protein. And this is what makes soil what it is. Soil would not be like it is without this GRSP, because this is put out by mycorrhizal fungi, strengthens soil part structure by aggregating those particles, stores huge amounts of carbon, holds the nutrients, and stabilizes heavy metals. So it's really keeping the soil together and making the kind of soil structure you see from the mycorrhizal fungi. So let's do a little history before we move on. And so Mycorrhizae was first identified, as well as much as we know, by a Polish scientist, Franciszek Kamiński, back in 1881. But he talked about it, but he wasn't really a publisher. So it was really A.B. Frank, a German, who got it out there to the world. And A.B. Frank was tasked by your favorite ruler, Wilhelm I of Prussia, to grow truffles agriculturally. And of course, he completely failed in that. But in his investigations, he noticed that there was this relationship between tree roots and fungi, and that this was beneficial. And he coined the term mycorrhizae, which I have to admit, it means fungal root. Sorry. And he coined the term symbiosis. And so he was really, kind of the pioneer in kind of understanding. Then, of course, there were other players, but a major one was a Frenchman named Galaud, who then really kind of identified these internal structures, drew them, tried to figure out what they were doing. And then Barbara Moss in the 1950s and 60s really moved it forward by showing how and why this relationship was happening, what was going on. So today, I mean, just like most science, it mostly takes place in China now, but there still are some of the major players are here. I mean, you know, outside of China, I guess. And these two of the biggest are Suzanne Simard, who you might have heard of. She wrote this book called Finding the Mother Tree, a really brilliant story. I really recommend it. And this is her new book that just came out. And then Merlin Sheldrake is English guy, and he wrote this book called Entangled Life. They're both really brilliant researchers, but also getting it out to the public, try to understand what this is. So somebody's telling me they're reading Entangled Life now. And then there's several different types of mycorrhizae. And we have arbuscular mycorrhizae. And this is by far the most common, almost, you know, the vast majority of plant species. And this is ancient. When the first plants crawled out of the ocean, gasping onto land, they were already mycorrhizal, and that was with arbuscular mycorrhizae. And so that's most plants. There's also ectomycorrhizae, which arose maybe about 150 million years ago. It arose independently more than 70 times. This came from decomposer fungi. And ectomycorrhizae is on pines and oaks. And then much more recently, you know, like 40, 50 million years ago, ericoid and orchid mycorrhizae developed. There's also another kind of mycorrhizae called Mycotina, which is not really understood at all, but it's definitely out there in a lot of plants, especially in moss and liverworts and hornworts and things. And it has very fine hyphae. It's also been around for a long time, but people don't really understand that well. But what this shows, the fact that this has evolved, not with this one, but these others independently many times, is that there's so many advantages to mutualisms and so many advantages to this mutualistic relationship that it, you know, evolves independently a number of times. Here you can see a really primitive plant, and in the fossil, in the rhizoids, you know, before roots were invented, the arbuscular mycorrhizae is there. Okay. If anybody has a question, please ask. Don't hesitate. So we'll start talking about arbuscular mycorrhizae. And this kind of mycorrhizae is in 80% of plant species, all kinds of plants, liverworts to junipers. And the fungus in this mycorrhizal relationship is, they're all in the phylum Glomeromycota. This phylum only has 350 species in it. It's a very small phyla. And almost all of them are involved in this mycorrhizal relationship. They cannot live independently. They can only live as a mutualist. You can't grow them in culture either. You can only grow them with the plant. And they have huge spores. So they've been around a long time. And they do not form an above ground fruiting body. The spores form underground. So you never see them above ground. The Glomeromycota are generalists. They're not decomposers, and they also have no cell walls. If we look at this hyphae here, there's two types. There's hyphae with cell walls, and there's hyphae without any cell walls. This is called coinocytic, and all the nuclei are just sloshing around. So the whole organism, which is huge, you know, hundreds of meters, it functions as a single large multinucleate cell. And this makes for really fast growth and really fast nutrient transport from where the phosphorus is obtained to getting it to the plant. So Glomeromycota have lacked sexual reproduction for the last 450 million years. So they reproduce other ways. And inside a single individual, you will have genetically distinct nuclei. So it's kind of changes that idea of what is individual. That's why this phylum's all still under debate and people are always kind of moving things around and stuff. Okay, so what this fungus does is it creates this vast underground network that extends the root system, and the fungus picks up the phosphorus and the nitrogen and sends it to the plant root and gets sugar in exchange. The plants are either obligate, which means if they're not mycorrhizal, they die, or they're facultative, which means they can go either way. They can be in the mycorrhizal relationship or they won't be, and they'll just be living on their own. Okay, and this is the classic picture where this plant here, when it has mycorrhizal fungi, much bigger than when it doesn't. Okay, so how does this start? Well, you have a root. So it's going to meet a piece of hyphae. The hyphae could be coming from another plant, or it's going to be coming from a spore. So if you're a spore, your hyphae has to find a plant root or you die. But the spores are large, like beach balls. So they can, I mean, not really, but you can see them with the naked eye. And so this hyphae can travel pretty far. And also, of course, plant roots have exudates that stimulate spore germination and help the hyphae find the root. Then when the hyphae gets there, the root cells respond to these chemical signals from the fungi and make a tunnel. And the fungal hyphae then enters the root. So, of course, everybody knows it's not a pathogenic species. And then the hyphae grow within the root cortex here, right there. And then they form inside the cell wall, up against the cell membrane. They form this complex arbuscle structure. So then you have the cell membrane and the fungus. And then you have nutrient transfer across that interface. So there's specific genetic pathways and complex signaling for this to happen. It takes a lot of messaging. And this messaging is the same all across the plant kingdom. Very stable. So then after a week or so, the arbuscle collapses. Of course, the fungus is busy making new ones. There's also vesicles, which store lipids all throughout. Here you can see there's some big old spores. You can see there's no fruiting body or anything. All it is spores in the soil. And they're large, so they don't go around with the wind. Okay. So what about the hyphae? Well, very high surface to volume ratio. So you have so much more absorption going on than you would with a plant because there's all that area. Also, plants have so much trouble obtaining phosphorus. It's one of the main reasons you have arbuscular mycorrhizae to get that phosphorus. Hyphae are skinny, so they can go into tiny soil pores, find that phosphorus with their really remarkable chemical armaments, I guess you could say, that can scavenge that phosphorus. And also, remember that GRRSP? There's all kinds of sticky proteins and stuff all over the place holding that soil together. This increases nutrient uptake by 1,000 times. Big number. And so that's one reason that plants are happier. So going into the mycorrhizae, it's 6 times faster than root hairs for picking up phosphorus. And it's really common for in a plant, all the phosphorus comes from fungi. So the relationship between the fungus and the plant is complex. But low soil phosphorus will often increase hyphal growth and branching as it searches for more. But if the plant is giving the fungus less sugar, the fungus will often retaliate, although this varies, by sending in less phosphorus. Okay, so there's kind of this balance game going on here. And of course, not every arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal species is the same. So, some act better with certain plants than others, but generally they're all generalists. Okay, so how do you study these things? So, I had these poor students. They'd never heard of mycorrhizae before. Then before you know it, they're just doing all kinds of stuff in the lab and everything. So if you want to find out how much mycorrhizal fungi is in your roots, what you do is you stain your roots with trypan blue, which colors chitin blue. And then you take the roots and you spread it out on a grid. And then you go down one of these lines and you come to some root and you see there's no blue in there. So that's a 0. Then you go further down the line. Oh, there's blue. There's fungus in there. And then you get a percentage of root colonization, which will basically tell you how much exchange is going on. Then if you want to find out how much mycorrhizal fungi is in your soil, what you do is you collect the soil. I did this all over Mount St. Helens and other places. You collect your soil, take it back to the lab, and you plant corn in the soil. Then, after a month, you harvest the corn, and you look at the roots of the corn. And the more colonization, then the more fungus is in the soil. So how do you identify these things? Well, historically, they used these gigantic spores. It's not easy to identify them. How do you get the spores? Well, historically, they used sugar centrifugation because then you have, like a gradient, and you make it so that the spores will float, and then you can gather them up. And then you can look at them under the microscope and say, I have no idea what that thing is. And now, of course, people use molecular methods, but it's complicated because they have many different nuclei. Okay, so arbuscular mycorrhizae is most common on mineral soils. And in this kind of landscape, the vast majority of the plants are arbuscular mycorrhizal, nutrient poor, dry soils. If your soil is really nutrient rich or organic rich, or you're in a wetland, then less so for arbuscular mycorrhizae. One of our most important plants here for arbuscular mycorrhizae is junipers, because there are, of course, a lot of them out there for those dry, nutrient poor, harsh, rocky soils. But if you're down in the desert, everything that you see, all those plants out there are going to be in this relationship. So for the fungal density and number of species, it's correlated with high plant diversity. So of course, tropical rainforests, you find a lot of species and also really high density. And of course, those are really poor soils in general. But also temperate grasslands, which is a different scenario. It's also really rich in arbuscular mycorrhizae. So some of the ecological implications are this. So plants of different species are linked underground into the same mycelial system. You have like plant A and plant B are hooked up to the same fungus, right? And plant C and plant D, all different species. Then you'll have a different fungus, which is hooked up also to some of those. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of stuff going on. They're linked underground, a common mycelial network. So one plant may provide the sugar to make a mycelial network that a different species then utilizes. So this is something that Merlin Sheldrake talks about in his books. Some is the arbuscular mycorrhizae balances this interactions between all these different plant species. Okay, so we'll talk about gametophytes for a second. And if everybody remembers what a gametophyte is, it's a haploid organism, just one set of chromosomes. So for your non-seed plants, they have a gametophyte stage, whole separate plant. And you get the sporophyte stage, which is diploid, like a fern or something. So that gametophyte stage is totally dependent upon mycorrhizal fungi. And when it's young, it is a parasite. It's fed by the mycorrhizal fungi. These little fern gametophytes really don't have anything to give in terms of photosynthate to the fungus. So the fungus supplies it with everything it needs. And think about a whisk fern gametophyte. It doesn't even photosynthesize. So it has to get all its resources from the mycorrhizal fungi. Then the adult plant is then engaged in mutualism. So this begins as a parasitism and shifts into a mutualism. And so, of course, this has been critical for the evolution of plants. Otherwise, they couldn't have made it. So that was our buscular mycorrhizae. Hopefully everybody's got that one down. So next we'll talk about ectomycorrhizae. And this is really different because now the fungus is going to be outside the root. And this involves about 6,500 species. And these are the kind of mushrooms that you know. The basidiomycetes, like mushrooms and puffballs, the ascomycetes, truffles and cup fungi and things like that. When you go out to a forest, most of the mushrooms that you see are ectomycorrhizal. And that's also making up about 30% of the forest soil microbial biomass. So a lot of organic matter out there. For the plants, it's 2,000 species, which is not a lot, but these are really, really important plants like pines and oaks and things. So when you shift up in elevation here, you're moving into a much more ectomycorrhizal landscape because, of course, you're with the pines and the oaks. Generally, the more organic the soil, the more ectomycorrhizae you're going to have. Once again, plants are either obligate, which means they have to do this, they have to be mycorrhizal, or they're facultative, which means they can be mycorrhizal or not. And some species, such as willows, are really versatile. They can be ectomycorrhizae, they can be arbuscular mycorrhizae, they can be non-mycorrhizal, and they go back and forth during their lifespan. The fungi might be specific to one particular plant species or not, and the plants are not specific. So they can go with any number of these fungi. So if you have a large tree, that's big, that's a lot of roots. It's going to be tapped into many, many different fungal species. And those fungi will be connected to multiple plants, kind of similar to arbuscular mycorrhizae with that kind of complexity. These fungi, however, were independent decomposers and then evolved the mycorrhizal ability, but they retained that ability to decompose, unlike arbuscular mycorrhizae, where they're not decomposers. So they are much better getting nitrogen. So this is ecto. So you can see there's a plant root. It's encased in fungi. Dig up a root of a ponderosa pine, you'll see that on there. This fungal sheath encases the root. This is both protective and for nutrient storage and whatnot. Then the hyphae penetrates here and forms what's called a heart-shaped net. And the fungi does not go through the cell wall. But you do have a large surface area for resource exchange, and the exchange happens across the cell wall of phosphorus and nitrogen and whatnot. Okay, so just like our arbuscular mycorrhizae, this is a huge amount of photosynthate goes to the fungi, and the fungi provide the plant with the same kind of resources, but much better at getting nitrogen because it can decompose organics. And the hyphae, once again, can go to places plants can't go, grow rapidly, grow here, grow there, and are good at getting phosphorus also. And then the hyphae extend over volume of soil thousands of times more than the root. So very effective. Ectomycorrhizae are different because, like I mentioned, they're really good at getting nitrogen, organic and inorganic nitrogen from the soil. They have that really remarkable, kind of compounds that will help them get nitrogen from the soil. So this is most of where a plant's nitrogen comes from. for the plant, there's hormonal interaction between the plant and the fungus. So then the plant doesn't bother to make any root hairs. Because why have root hairs if you have ectomycorrhizal fungi? But their roots branch more. So there's more space for the sheath, right, to cover the root. So I'll tell you one quick little story. There's this one fungus called Lacaria bicolor. So it's ectomycorrhizal, and it makes this special hyphae, which are toxic. And there's an innocent springtail. The hyphae approaches it and kills it with its toxins. Then the hyphae envelops and surrounds the springtail and absorbs the nitrogen out of the springtail and then sends it to the tree. So they did these studies with white pine, and a quarter of the nitrogen in the white pine came from springtails. It's like, whoa. Question?
Yeah, okay, I don't know springtails. They look like they're mobile.
Yes, they're
Got legs.
I know you would think it would run away, but it's just like how nematodes also capture things. I mean, no, there are fungus that capture nematodes and things like this. Yeah, they have ways to sting these things. Yeah. I mean, we can escape, but we still get athlete's foot and stuff too. So, so I guess fungi are pretty wily. Yeah. So here's kind of a big picture of the forest where the canopy trees are making sugar, and it goes down to the mycorrhizal fungi, and then that sugar is used by the fungus and also goes to other plant seedlings and other adult trees. And then nutrients cycle through here from the mycorrhizal fungi. Of course, they're leaky and they have a lot of associated microbes. Those things would be locked in the soil, but they become available for plants. And then what the fungi has go up into the plants, and then the trees are sharing things back and forth. What's complicated is the dynamics of that and how it happens. Okay. So the next kind of mycorrhizae we want to talk about is called orchid mycorrhizae. So this is only in orchids, as you might guess. And this is the same kind of fungus as ectomycorrhizae, ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. And some of these are actually also ectomycorrhizal. So they can go either way. And unlike the other kinds of mycorrhizae, some of these fungi can be independent decomposers and not be mycorrhizal, which in general fungus can't do. Some can also be plant diseases, plant pathogens, and the fungi are specific to generalists. Some orchid mycorrhizal fungi can only be on one orchid species, others can be on many. Orchids have a much more complex relationship because they can go, for example, be very specific when they're young and become more generalist when they're old, or cycle through different fungal species. But orchids have to be mycorrhizal to survive. And this starts with that tiny, tiny, tiny seed, right? Orchids have the tiniest seeds. There's nothing in there. A seed cannot germinate and survive on its own. It has to be mycorrhizal. And of course, it's parasite on the fungus. It's getting everything it needs to grow because there's nothing in an orchid seed. So they have to be together at the same place. When spores aren't there, the orchids won't germinate. Of course, these are very small spores, so they're in the air and everything all the time. Then, of course, the mature orchid is mutualistic. The parasitic stage is only in the beginning. However, there are non-photosynthetic orchids, and these are like this. Maybe some of you know the snow orchid, and that is parasitic its whole life on mycorrhizal fungi, not on another plant, on the mycorrhizal fungi. Of course, the resources sugar-wise are coming from another plant, flowing through the fungus and then into the snow orchid. But yeah, it's parasitic. So how does this work? Well, the hyphae penetrate into root cells and they form these coils called pelotons. And then the orchid actually digests the living peloton to get its resources. And the fungus keeps on making more pelotons, and those get digested. And then here we have our last type of mycorrhizae. You're like, can't do anymore. But anyway, this is ericoid. So the Ericaceae, the blueberry family, has its own special types of mycorrhizal fungi. This is also ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. And most ericoids live in acidic, nutrient-poor soils. That's a really common place for them to be. And they have what's called sclerophilous leaves, which are very leathery, with very little nitrogen in there, so they don't decay. But these ericoid mycorrhizal fungi have remarkable decomposer abilities, and they can really extract that organic P, the phosphorus, and the nitrogen from these leaves by decomposing them. They're tough to decompose. So this is really important in these environments because it conserves minerals in the really very poor litter by directly cycling these nutrients back into plants. Some of these ericoid mycorrhizae are also ectomycorrhizae. Some can be free-living decomposers. They're very flexible, makes them very adaptable to surviving, pretty harsh environments. And the plants, they have certain specialized roots with no root hairs for the fungi to colonize. And the hyphae penetrate the root epidermal cells with dense coils of hyphae, similar to orchid mycorrhizae. Then that's one type of mycorrhizae. There's also another whole type of mycorrhizal fungi called arbutoid. And this is in your manzanitas and madrones, just not that many plant species really. And this is similar to ectomycorrhizae. It's similar fungi, but some hyphae do penetrate into root cells. Otherwise, it can look a lot like ectomycorrhizal with a sheath on the outside. But it's different because of that penetration. Lastly, there's monotropoid mycorrhizae. And this is a completely parasitic relationship. These plants do not photosynthesize, such as pine saps and pine drops and whatnot. And they parasitize the ectomycorrhizae, that's on oaks and pines and whatnot. But unique structures are formed. And for some reason, the fungus goes along with it. And these plants absorb the nutrients and the sugar that they need straight from the fungus. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about some research that I did a while ago. This is, who knows where this is?
Yes, yeah.
Mount St. Helens. So after the eruption, of course, there is no mycorrhizal fungi out there, but plant colonization is going to occur somehow. It did. Also, these soils are very poor. It's very low in phosphorus, especially, even with all those little spiders and things that were raining down on the landscape, so nutrients enter. So what's the process here? Well, the first plants to colonize these landscapes have to either be non-mycorrhizal, because there is no mycorrhizal fungi, or facultative, which means it can go either way. So when the facultative mycorrhizal plants colonize, then if a spore gets up there, remember, if we're talking about arbuscular mycorrhizae, these spores are huge. They don't blow on the wind. So how would they get there? Well, it takes decades. And the way they get there is generally with elk carrying them in. And so then these facultative mycorrhizal plants, poster child for this is Pearly Everlasting, really common in Mount St. Helens. Then they can become mycorrhizal. Then all those obligate plants, which is most plant species, can then colonize that landscape. And you get all your penstemons and all that kind of thing coming in. So the plants adapted to disturbed environments are non-mycorrhizal or facultative. And you can see that, for example, if some places abandoned, plants like mustards are generally non-mycorrhizal, really good at invading these disturbed sites in the beginning. However, Ectomycorrhizal fungi have spores that are tiny. You're breathing them in right now. So when the firs colonized Mount St. Helens, those fungi were there because the spores are everywhere. So it's a very different process. Now, phosphorus levels are very low. So actually, in the beginning, the mycorrhizal fungi for some of these plants like Pearly Everlasting was parasitic because it was taking more sugar and giving very little phosphorus back because it couldn't get the phosphorus. As conditions improved, that shifted over into being a mutualism. Okay, so here's one of our last ideas. This is the wood wide web. And this is really one of the things that really brought mycorrhizae into the mainstream. So Suzanne Simard, back in 1997, was a graduate student at Oregon State. And she'd had a background in forestry from British Columbia. And, you know, it's kind of this male-dominated industry. So they knew the best way to grow trees was to just nuke everything, kill it all, and plant trees. But she noticed that the Douglas firs were not growing as well as they had before. And things were really declining. So that kind of spawned her research. But she caught a lot of abuse for this. As did A.B. Frank back in 1885 when he said there was a beneficial relationship. People said, no way, you're nuts. This is fungus, it's just diseases. So she was a very strong, confident person and went ahead and did this work. What she found was that the ectomycorrhizae and birch trees and Douglas firs were connected. The sugars flowed between these tree roots with a net gain for young Douglas fir. If you think about what happens up there, the birches come in first and grow really fast, and then the Douglas fir comes in later. So these birches subsidize the young Douglas firs with sugar. So then they grow faster. And if the Douglas firs were stressed by shade, they would get more sugar from the birches. Then the birches would get carbon and resources when they were leafless, especially in the spring. So this was a mutually beneficial relationship, not competition. And then as her work went on, she identified these mother trees, which were nodes. And you see this here, the big green ones. You have these main nodes, and this is where the most number of mycorrhizal fungi are connected. And these mother trees kind of communicate with these other plants, and they supply seedlings with the resources that they need. They're centralized hubs for communication and nutrient exchange. So these trees are connected in a wood wide web where they communicate and send nutrients to neighbors. These are like neural networks and stuff. So next time you're in the forest, remember it's all going on out there. So it's something that I don't really have time to talk about. I have no idea what time it is, but probably getting there. Are these mycorrhizal products. But you want to remember that the arbuscular mycorrhizal spores are large. They don't get around. And that's basically almost every agricultural crop or horticultural plant. So if you have, kind of a potting soil you're going to buy somewhere and stuff, it probably doesn't have any mycorrhizal fungi in it. So depending on what you're doing, this can be really worthwhile to get soil that is, fortified. But you can also, try getting it other ways by taking some soil from somewhere else and adding it and stuff. So, but there's a lot more, of course, with this.
You're about 10 minutes out.
Okay, a lot more with this topic. Of course, it's also a topic in modern agriculture. So lastly, just kind of end on this, was way back. We all remember her though. Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society. And we're each on our own, or should be. See that should be? And owe nothing to each other and the common good. So this is what people like to think about, and some echoes today, of course. So, but a forest is not isolated individuals, red in tooth and claw, it is a community of beings exchanging resources and information. It is a society. So we are all parts of systems and relationships. that each of us is not so much an individual, but a node on a network, a plural being whose body is made up of billions of microorganisms, as well as what we call human. So kind of a part of biology is relatively new called processual biology. Looks at the world as made up of processes rather than objects, as phenomena forever flowing and changing and thereby exchanging with each other and changing into each other. So you, as a living organism, are dynamic, a shifting process. You are not a static substance, just in case you're wondering about that. So a person who's talks about this a lot, talks about all kinds of other really great things. She's great. I don't know if any of you know her, is Rebecca Solnit. I mean, she's really brought this into kind of thinking into modern politics today and stuff. All right. So when you're out there, just remember, this is what you see above ground, but there's a lot of stuff going on down here. So if there's any questions?
Yeah, not to put it the dark side too much, but I was wondering about the parasitic aspect of this. It seems like the plants opening up these tunnels, as you said, letting the mycorrhizal come in. It seems like that sort of situation could be exploited. Is there a kind of a mycorrhizal mafia out there?
Well, remember, it's been going on for 450 million years. It
Evolutionarily
really
like
works. It works. Otherwise, they all wouldn't be doing it. And but this is something that like Merlin Sheldrake has really thought about, is how is this managed? The flow of sugar to this plant or that plant? What is the relationship between these different fungi that are hooked to the same plant? Right? And the sugar flowing into the fungus and flowing back out again into another plant. And also the share, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and these resources. So there's complex management going on. And I don't know, but it's rarely parasitic. Often it's parasitic because it's a trade-off. The mycorrhizal fungi is helping that little gametophyte or helping the orchid seed. And then you enter into mutualism later. Of course, there are plants who take advantage of it.
snow.
Like, the snow orchid. And then there are pathogenic fungi, of course, which are disease fungi, taking advantage of plants in general. But I mean, I don't think of parasitism as a bad thing anyway. I mean, we're all parasites, I suppose. Right. Thank you.
I got a question. As far as like invasive species that come from other continents, are they often facultative mycorrhizal, like where they don't have to have a mycorrhizal, or are they just tapping the
So
mycorrhizal system?
the vast majority are either non-mycorrhizal or facultative, which is why they're so good at this. Not all of them, but that's really common. And, from the East, one of the most famous of that is garlic mustard, which is non-mycorrhizal and secretes these cyanide compounds that kills mycorrhizal fungi and outcompetes other plants that way by knocking out their mutualists. But yeah, that's really common for invasives.
So you talked about the soil on Mount St. Helens, and then I don't know anything about how the soil becomes sterilized by fire, but is there does anybody think about, is it mycorrhizae that have to colonize, or how does that work? Is it the same as Mount St. Helens?
You mean, after
Really hard.
if you have an intense fire.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sterilized.
But even intense fire, it's not that deep.
So the
Where it's
mycorrhizae.
hot. Yeah, it'll be below. Right. But sure, underneath that Walmart parking lot's probably pretty rough down there right now. But of course, that's so close that, actually they're pretty big. So it could take a while. It'll be colonized by non-mycorrhizal species first, those cracks in the pavement. Yeah. But yeah, fire would have to be really hot just because of the insulating abilities of soils. And people have definitely looked at that.
So are the soil animals in fauna feeding on these guys?
Oh, there's definitely fungivores. Yes, totally. Yep. Yeah, and I didn't talk about that at all because it's another whole big topic. But yeah, that's another active part of it is it's all those other microbes down there and small invertebrates and stuff eating everything.
A great talk.
Well, thank you.
Couple slides showed that liverworts, and I assume this is also can have a mycorrhizal
Yes,
relationship. But
not always. Sometimes they do.
what I don't get, there have been rumors about that kind of thing for a while, but as you know, they don't have roots.
Yeah,
They have rhizoids, but in terms of flow through the rhizoids, virtually no flow occurs through a rhizoid.
right.
So where does that relationship, how does that work?
So, yeah,
Can you
I
try
don't,
to repeat that a little bit?
oh, okay, yeah. So Russ was wondering about where does that relationship occur in mosses and liverworts and whatnot? Because there's not much going on in those rhizoids. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah. Good question. I'll have to look that one up. So, I mean, because there is a lot more in a gametophyte where it enters through the rhizoids, and a lot of moss, I mean, some mosses, especially some liverworts, are not mycorrhizal, but a lot are also. So they're engaged in this relationship. And there was a gentleman in Ontario who was working on this, but I forgot his name. It's been a while. So good question, though. What exactly is happening with these, non-vascular plants?
We have a question in the chat.
Oh,
Okay, is the growth of the mycorrhizal spores dependent on a successful interaction with another organism?
so the hyphae from these spores has to reach a root. Otherwise it dies. So yes, it has to interact with a plant. Otherwise it can't get sugar. So some ectomycorrhizal fungi can live independently, but for the vast majority, the arbuscular, no, which is most, the vast majority out there. So yeah, it has to interact with a plant.
Any other questions?
So should you till the soil in your garden?
I mean, the hyphae are still there and they can come out of chunks of roots or anything. So, yeah, and the spores are still there. And, the arbuscular spores are down there in your soil right now. And so it'll be okay. Yeah. What happens with modern agriculture is that the soil does become sterile. But then they subsidize by dumping so much, these are annuals that they're growing. They subsidize it by dumping fertilizers.
So John, your long career as an educator, I'm sure it was a distinguished career. Did you have much opportunity to teach students about fungi? As I find the students I get, there is a void in knowledge about fungi.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to hear your perspective.
I never had a course on mycology because it wouldn't have been full. I mean, you had to have 12 students for a course to go. And it never would have happened. But
were you in Fredonia? Were you taught?
Yeah, I would have to have 12 students.
Okay.
But when I taught plant ecology, and then of course research students, they did learn this as like a part of, for the students that worked on the mycorrhizal projects, then they did have to learn. And then plant ecology course, upper level, they had a unit in the mutualism section. So, but no, I never taught a course like that. But you do.
And most of what I know, I learned from this guy right here. Yeah, and we don't have 12 students, but the students we get are very enthusiastic.
Excellent. That's good.
Yeah, so I know Keller. I'm learning a lot from you.
Uh-oh.
And from Russ, lichens up there. this worldwide web of
Motivation.
professors.
Woodward.
Woodwide, all right. All right.
I know you mentioned a couple of movies having opened up people's mind with all of this, but I think Overstory did a lot.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah. Also, kind of depressing, but yeah. And one of the characters in there is kind of patterned after
Right.
Susan Samard. Yeah. So yeah, I would recommend that, called Overstory. But yeah, read Entangled Life and The Mother Tree if you're kind of interested. Okay, well, thank you.